we're live.
We are.
Hello, Mentioners! Today we're going to be taking a look at a video by Drew McCoy, the Genetically Modified Skeptic, who asks this question.
If atheists argued like apologists, do you think the religious would buy our arguments, or...
So basically what he's going to be doing in this video is reversing a lot of the popular apologetics arguments and showing what they would look like if you were to use them in support of atheism. The general gist being, aren't these ridiculous arguments? Try listening to them from the point of view of an atheist and see how ridiculous they sound.
Nothing is ever going to convince me that God exists. I admit that that's where I start from.
It's true. If you look behind him, you'll see a little paper that has a BS on it and an arrow pointing down. And then underneath of that arrow are a couple of Christian books and a set of essential oils. This all plays into Drew McCoy's backstory. You see, he wasn't always a genetically modified skeptic. At one point he was a Christian. But then he went to college, and his family got into essential oils, and he researched that and saw how ridiculous that was, and then he realized that science, the same thing that debunked essential oils, also debunked Christianity. And that's when Drew McCoy became the genetically modified skeptic. So, now he's going to parody a bunch of apologetics arguments. Let's see what the first one is.
People say that the existence of goodness proves that God exists, but no, let me tell you why that's false. Good can only exist if evil exists. You wouldn't even know good exists without evil. Here's the interesting part. Evil only exists in the absence of anything divine. Therefore, because good exists, God doesn't exist.
Let me ask you something. Are you a theist?
Yeah, I am.
Have you ever told a lie?
Yeah, I think everyone has.
Have you ever stolen something?
Well, yeah, sure. Probably.
Do you think everyone would say those things are wrong all the time?
I think it really depends on who you ask. I don't know if everyone would say it's wrong all the time.
Right, therefore morality is subjective. There is no God.
You can't have a rationally justified basis of morality without basing it on well-being rather than God. If someone has a different God than another, there's essentially no way one could argue their moral basis over the other. Morality must come from outside one's own faith.
Now it's important here to note that Drew McCoy is not, in fact, making an argument for atheism or even assessing the argument for theism. He's simply trying to show how ridiculous these arguments are.
These arguments are all pretty ridiculous, just as they are when they're used in defense of religion.
Now, the three clips that we just saw are all parodying specific apologists and how they've made the argument, but they're all assessing a particular argument, and that is the moral argument. The moral argument essentially states that if there's such a thing as real right and wrong that applies to everyone throughout history, in every culture, everywhere. So, for instance, we all agree that murder of an innocent person is wrong. If that's wrong across the board and applies to everyone, then there must be some kind of foundation or standard in which that is rooted. And the theistic argument is that that standard has to be above race and culture and time. It has to apply to everyone, and therefore it must be personal and transcendent. So in other words, right, goodness, virtue, law is founded in God's nature. So the first one he sort of makes a nod to is Frank Turek. And Turek is famous for making a sort of Platonic argument for virtue and goodness. So what does that mean? It means that in order to have some kind of law, and we're talking about all kinds of law, rationality and virtue and order, all law has to be grounded in the transcendent. So in order to make this argument, for instance, against theism, he would have to appeal to things like logic and rationality and moral law. And so in order to have all of that grounded There has to be some kind of standard above and beyond. So he assesses that and says that, if evil exists, then there can't be a God, essentially. So he's shifting the standard off of moral law, of goodness and virtue, and on to evil, saying that evil is the standard against which we judge good. Here's how that doesn't work. That doesn't work because you have to have some kind of order. You can't put a standard on disorder. There are no 10 commandments of chaos, of evil. No, you can't have that, because evil, chaos, all of those things are simply a deprivation of good. So in other words, stealing is wrong because property is good. If there were no such thing as property, there couldn't be theft. Murder is wrong because life is good. If there were no such thing as life, you couldn't have murder. So evil isn't a standard. It's the deprivation of something good. Good is the standard. You could have good without evil, but you can't have evil without good. So this actually makes sense if we grant that there are certain things, such as rationality law, that we have to appeal to. So for instance, I believe it was Aristotle that talked about honor among thieves. Now this is an expression we all see, but what he says essentially is that for thieves to even gather together and work together in order to thieve, then they have to have some kind of hierarchy. They have to listen to whatever the commander or who's in charge and follow those orders and share the theft. You can't have this disorder to the maximum degree in order to even commit the theft. You have to have some kind of plan. You have to avoid capture. There are certain things that you have to do rationally, laws you have to follow in order to break the law. So the idea is that there has to be standards in order to have disorder, because disorder is simply the lack of order. Bad is the lack of good, and evil shows that there must be such a thing as good. So I would argue that this argument actually does make rationale and sense, and it's been grounded in thousands of years of philosophy that are agreed upon by philosophers, both Christian and atheist.
A maximally great naturalistic law of physics exists in some possible world. But if such a law exists in some possible world, it must exist in every possible world. If it exists in every possible world, it exists in the actual world. Therefore, a maximally great naturalistic law of physics exists in the actual world. This precludes the existence of a truly omnipotent God.
Okay, so what he's assessing here is the ontological argument, as made by William Lane Craig, and I don't blame him for thinking that this argument sounds ridiculous. That's kind of a common notion. The ontological argument isn't easy to understand, and it may not be a great argument. I think it may be, but it's not one I would press, because it's difficult to understand and it sounds ridiculous on first blush. At any rate, the argument is kind of like this. If it is possible to take all of the properties we were just talking about, things like rationality and goodness and logic and beauty and justice and all of the things that are good, love, for instance, and ball them up and put them in a single source, one source that emanates all of these good properties, what we call great making properties, wisdom and knowledge and so forth. All of these good things that we can all point to as being great things. Ball them up, put them in a single source, and say that this is the source of all good things. Then this is a maximally great being. And part of great making properties is personality. So this is a personal being, one that is relational, because relationship is a great making property. And if you could ball this up and make a single maximally great being, if it is possible that such a thing exists, then it must exist because existence itself is a great making property. So in general, this is said that if it's possible for it to exist in any possible world, like say if this is if this is a logically, rationally existent being, if you can kind of envision that such a being might exist, and it's possible that it's logical that such a being might be able to exist, then it exists, because existence is a great making property. Now he flips this around and says, well, if there's a maximally great law of naturalism, and you see this often as a response to the ontological argument. You'll say, well, if it's possible that a maximally great pizza exists, then it must exist. If it's possible that a maximally great rabbit exists, then it must exist. This idea that, it's ridiculous to say that if something is maximally great, then it must exist, because, it's just verbiage. You're using language to somehow pull something into existence. But of course, this doesn't work with anything besides what we call God. Now let's say it's not God. Let's just call it a maximally great being. You can't have a maximally great rabbit, because rabbit by definition has limitations. For instance, rabbit has a wiggly nose. Rabbit is a physical being. If you take away its physicality, then it's not a rabbit. If you take away its ears, then it's not a rabbit. There are certain constraints that make a rabbit not maximally great. Pizza is consumable. If it's consumable, it goes away. If it goes away, it's got boundaries that make it not maximally great. He uses a law of naturalism. Naturalism, of course, is the alternative to supernaturalism. Naturalism states that matter and energy, things that we can touch and see, are the only things that exist. Things that can be measured and weighed and identified. That way, because if there was anything spiritual that exists outside of the physical universe, then there must be the possibility of spiritual beings such as a God. Now, of course, energy and matter can't give you things like logic and rationality and goodness and love and so forth, because all of those are transcendent things that exist above matter and energy. So the parity of this argument doesn't really work against the argument. If properly understood, the argument is rationally sound. If it's possible that a maximally great being with all of these transcendent properties, such as law and beauty, exist, then existence, being a maximally great attribute, must be part of this being, and if it's possible that such a being exists, then such a being exists. Now I've just laid it out, and he says it's a ridiculous argument. Maybe it does sound ridiculous, but it's something that is philosophically sound. You be the judge of whether that's something that could be considered.
I hate to do it, because the guy who whips out his credentials comes off as just kind of a jerk, but I do have a relevant PhD, making me an expert on this topic.
So what he's saying here is that just saying that you have a degree doesn't make what your argument is right. And of course, this is the logical fallacy we call appeal to authority, meaning that just citing an authority or saying that you're an authority of subject doesn't automatically make what you're saying right. You have to make an argument. Now, I don't think that any of these people that he's talking about actually just say, hey, God exists because I'm an authority. No. They probably make some kind of argument. But if they're whipping out their degrees and backing themselves up, yeah, this can be annoying. Atheists sometimes do this as well, and it's annoying when they do it. I wouldn't want to do it either. That said, there is such a thing as an expert witness, and they'll pull these into, say, court cases. If you happen to be an expert on, say, scholarship, Bible scholarship, and you say that based on your expertise in Bible scholarship, X, Y, and Z are right, there is a certain validity to that argument. I would not say that just because you're an expert in that field, you must be right, but there is some rationale or basis upon which you can say, I'm an expert in a field, and that will, in a way, back up your argument. Still, whipping out degrees just to prove your point isn't great. Nobody likes that.
The problem is that you've suppressed the truth in irrationality. Deep down, you know that God doesn't exist because you can't know anything without the understanding of that fundamental truth of the universe.
Okay, so presuppositionalism, which is what he's talking about here, takes two particular forms. There's one form in which I think it works as an argument with an atheist about the possibility of the truth of theism. And then there's another form of presuppositionalism, which is a very in-house debate between Christians. So the form that he's parodying here is more the in-house debate. I would certainly never use this argument with an atheist because, frankly, it's a little insulting. Basically, it says that in our core, every one of us has a sense of God, has this sense that there is, in fact, a God, and that those who say they don't believe in God are simply suppressing this deep instinct that they have towards the truth of God's existence. All right, well, I could actually make a psychological argument for the possibility that we do have this internal sense of God. But I wouldn't tell an atheist that, hey, you believe in God, you're just suppressing it, because that's insulting, and it doesn't take their experience and their word into account. So it's not a great argument against an atheist. Now, the form of presuppositionalism, which is kind of a good argument against atheism, is to trace their line of reason back to the core. Now, this is something we've been talking again and again in this video, so I'll say it again. In order to make a case against the existence of God, you have to appeal to things like rationality, logic, reason, and sometimes even morality, if you're going to make the argument of evil, saying that because evil exists, God doesn't. Well, of course, as we've discussed, for evil to exist, it has to have some good upon which it's based. So, for instance, what's the wrong answer to 2 plus 2? Wrong answer might be 5, but it might be airplane. It might be flinging poo at your opponent. Any of those is the wrong answer. There's only one right answer. So this is a standard or a foundation that forms the rationality upon which we base everything. He himself is saying these are ridiculous arguments. Well, for us to say that they're ridiculous, we have to have some kind of standard of rationality that we would judge reason and ridicule against. So that's presuppositionalism insofar as we presuppose certain foundations in order to make an argument. When he comes in and says something like, because the world is so evil, there can't be a good God, both of us have to recognize that there is an evil world out there. He's assuming that when he comes and tells me the world is evil, that I would agree with that. And to an extent I would. There is certainly a lot of evil in the world that we have to deal with. But since we both realize that, we both work off of certain presuppositions that have to have a grounding. So once again, this works back to God being the grounding of all rationality, all justice, all good things. God is the great making, the maximally great being, to which we have to appeal in order to even have this conversation.
Why would you want there to be a God? Why would you want to live in such a tyrannically governed dystopia where there's no hope or purpose but to give praise unto a being which apparently cares so little for your existence? So, to our benefit, with some difficulty, with a certain amount of historical knowledge, we construct a belief that helps us discover what we ought to do and how we ought to live, in the belief that there is freedom from such a painful reality.
Okay, so it's going to be a little difficult for me to respond to this because I'm not very familiar with the argument that he's making. It almost sounds like this idea that in order to have a beneficial world, we have to have some kind of standard around which we can rally. And I've heard this say that, we almost need a useful fiction. Religion is a useful fiction that we would have to have in order to have an orderly society. So, for instance, there have been studies that show that the community that religion provides is actually helpful to, say, mental health and to building sort of a society that we can all agree on our standards and come to certain kinds of relationships that are only founded on having a common goal and a common standard that we appeal to. So this is the best I can say about this. Now, honestly, there are some psychological arguments that support this. There are studies that show the benefits of having common standards in a community, and most of history has been rallied around one type of religion or another. But of course, those same arguments could be used for most religions. Now, there's a particular study that shows that of the different religions that offer these types of community, that Protestant Christianity kind of comes out on top. It provides the most support for community and so forth. I wouldn't use that as an argument for the truth of Christianity, and almost it seems like he's not using this argument for the truth of, in his case, atheism. It's basically, the argument seems to be that it's useful whether or not it's true, which honestly is a fairly ridiculous argument as far as I'm concerned. Now, I'm aware that my responses to these arguments may echo the same kind of thing that he was trying to parody in the arguments. Now, when we've responded to these arguments, the variety of my responses have to do with this idea that there are central laws, rules, or immaterial abstracts to which we refer, whether we're a Christian or an atheist or any other worldview, in order to have a reasonable discussion about things. We assume things like the reality of the world, the reliability of our senses in determining the reality of the world, and logic and reason and so forth. Now, it would be perfectly rational for an atheist to try to find some other grounding for these standards, and a lot of them do, and they're interested in this kind of discussion. So the discussion itself is not inherently ridiculous or irrational. This discussion comes from the first origins of philosophy itself. These are the kinds of things pondered by Plato and Aristotle. Now, these were not theists. Plato said that there must be some kind of standard outside of the physical reality we see, and he called this standard the good. And he said we don't have direct access to it except through the kinds of reasons we can have. Aristotle said that there must be some kind of external, unchanging force which actualized all of the things that we can see. Again, this was not a theistic argument. It was just this rational philosophical argument about abstracts. Tying this to theism was something that was done by later philosophers like Pascal or Anselm, who took these Greek ideas and then tried to tie them to biblical ideas. And then we had later atheistic type philosophers like Sartre or Camus or Nietzsche that attempted to tie in the kind of rationality of these abstracts in a materialistic sense, or just say that life was irrational fundamentally and that these were just sort of subjects of our irrational mind. So this kind of argumentation and philosophy works up to today. You have atheistic philosophers like Graham Opie or Benjamin Watkins who tend to try to come up with reasons why we have these standards that we all sort of understand and appeal to without some kind of transcendence or abstract, which it's an interesting discussion and it's worth having. Now, Genetically Modified Skeptic here bases all of his discussions, if you watch his videos, on science. He tries to assess Christianity from the scientific perspective. And that's legitimate. It's a perfectly interesting and good discussion to be had. But science is not a substitute for philosophy. Both of them are legitimate discussions, and taken seriously, the kinds of argumentation we've made are worth discussing, and not everybody dismisses them like Genetically Modified Skeptic here. So keep this in mind if you're interested in philosophy. This is an interesting discussion. I'm not saying theists are necessarily correct on this, but it's worth looking into and addressing. So those are the arguments in this series that he tries to parody, and do they sound ridiculous? I would suppose it's based on how those arguments are made. If you're willing to fairly assess them, I think there are strong points to be made in at least some of them. And so, if atheists argued like apologists, well, the problem that comes with this is that all of these apologetics arguments are based on the fundamental premise that there are certain transcendent standards that actually exist and actually guide us and make argumentation possible, because you can't argue without rationality and logic and things like that. You can't make the problem of evil argument if there is no standard of good against which to judge evil. So all of these things have to be true in order for us to even have these discussions. And that best works if you have some kind of metaphysical foundation that you can appeal to. Atheism just doesn't have that. So when an atheist makes an argument, they have to make an argument which is founded fundamentally on just matter and energy. And you just don't get standards from matter and energy. So the very fact that we have standards to which we can appeal kind of suggests that there is some kind of rational world that exists outside of just the physical world. I've been Joel Furchess for The Mentionables.